Welcome to Strip Cover Lit, where we squeeze the bigger picture out of literature. I'm Adrian Fort, and you are here for the fourth installment of a 9-part series as we journey through John Hall Wheelock's What is Poetry? This chapter is so pleasantly titled, The Poem in the Nuclear Age. And we start, as we have started all of these chapters, though I have not necessarily read them on the show, with an inset quote, this from Auden: "We must love one another or die. Then give me death." But we should move on to our opening paragraph, our mission statement for the chapter, which reads as such. "When I speak to you about myself, I am speaking to you about yourself. How is it you don't see that?" In these words, Victor Hugo puts his finger on the secret behind all communication. For if it is the separation into selves that makes communication necessary, it is their basic oneness that makes it possible. Whether by the use of words or, as in the case of bees, by means of symbolic acts and precision dances, communication predicates a prior mutual agreement resting upon the correspondences between selves that, though separate, at root are one. Language is such a prior mutual agreement, one of the forms through which the I-thou, to borrow Martin Buber's phrase, expresses itself. In a world where the sole relationship was the I-it, there would be no need for or responsibility of language. Swinburne, himself not notable for any lack of eloquence, has written, "Words divide and rend, but silence is the most notable. Words divide and rend, but silence is most notable till the end." Actually, of course, and who knew it better than he did? Words are symbols of the unity existing throughout the parts of one multitudinous self, divided in this very way, perhaps in order to effect the maximum opportunity for communication. As a tree puts forth its multiplicity of leaves, which talk to one another when the wind moves among them. A, what an absolute hippie way to end a paragraph. But B, it is also this sameness that allows the mechanism of literature to work. When we are reading Hamlet, we are reading Hamlet as it pertains to ourself. When we are reading Emily Dickinson, we read Emily Dickinson as her poems speak to the self. Even something so poppy and garbage as Harry Potter. We make our way through those books in order that we further illustrate the self. Moving on in this chapter, we get a quote on page 41. "If you have ever listened to the talk of baseball fans, or even of income tax experts, for the income tax in all its refinements has become an art form, you will realize how much of what we call communication is pure soliloquy based upon a mutual system of reference. In other words, upon a prior unity of minds." A little bit ironic for someone who's speaking into a camera alone, but I think that this is also a little bit about what he is referring to when he talks about the great spring of inspiration, that which he's referred to as necessary in previous chapters, and needing to be returned to poetry, perhaps. But I'm not exactly sure he really gets to his point here. I'm really not sure. This entire chapter is really sort of a devolvement, and we'll get to that towards the end. But when speaking to these baseball fans or income tax experts, it is almost impossible, I will not say impossible, to damp the percolation of one's own interest. I think that when you are listening to someone who is passionate about any subject, it is definitely easier to be involved in that subject yourself. This is the gift of the great teacher. This is the gift of the great orator. And this is the gift of the great writer. But the enthusiasm need not be so simply put. And I think that is what Wheelock is refusing to acknowledge through some of this book so far. So moving on in this, on 41 and 42, we get this entry. The poet is enabled to arouse the fullest response, and the one most nearly identical with his own excitement, by the use of allusions, legends, myths, or beliefs, familiar to his readers or listeners. Dante and Milton, as Yeats points out, had their mythologies. Shakespeare, the characters of the English history and of traditional romance. These had well-defined connotations for a large number of people in our own day. We have experienced an enormous increase in the means of communication, but with this increase, there has come about a steady decrease in the body of myth, legend, and belief familiar to all. A familiarity that has made possible in poetry and other arts the total response that can be called forth only where the artist and public have roots in the same cultural soil. To cite an example on the most elementary level, if you have never heard of Cain, the phrase "the curse of Cain" will be meaningless. On a more complex level, if you haven't read Wordsworth, you will make little sense of Housman's mischievous lines, "O cuckoo, shall I call thee bird, or but a wandering voice? State the alternative preferred, with reasons for your choice." And this is, I believe, an interesting point, and one that has splintered even further those things which might be considered literature. Yes, video games when well done, comic books, pop music, all of these things. But I think that this truth is also to be credited for the rise of new criticism. And criticisms and schools of criticism are merely, normally, simply a reflection of the art which is popular at that time, or the art which can be easily defined during a time when the school of criticism is emerging. And new criticism considers works as self-contained and self-referential. And I think that that is absolutely necessary to new voices entering the wellspring of communication. The communication that is enabled by things such as print. Saying that works can, will, and nearly must build their own symbols is empowering to a writer rather than debilitating. Because if I write a story and in my story the animal of a crow takes on a certain significance, it takes on that significance in my text. I am allowed to build that mythology of the crow in my work. This does not disable the crow in my work from having contextual conversations with the reader, with the crow in classical work, with the crow in Poe, with the crow in movies, the crow, with the crow in comic books. So these are all things that are still enabled to the reader, to the critic, to the audience, to the consumer, but they are not tools which must be used or utilized or even known to the writer. And I think that is a strength rather than a weakness. Even if even if. So it may be possible for the writer not to know any of the classical symbology circling around a symbol that the writer chooses, that an artist chooses, pardon me, because this is not simply about writing or poetry, which is something I think we'll get back to in this video. But it is possible for a writer to create a mythology of his or her own. And Wheelock, to his credit, does a good job of explaining some of that in this chapter, though I don't think they are his greater points, so I will not read them. Living in a world where new criticism is what new criticism is, it almost necessitates that the writer build his or her own mythology to some degree. And it is possible to build your own mythology without exposure to other mythologies, completely in ignorance of their existence. But knowledge of their existence would almost certainly behoove the writer. So I'm not sure, again, that this is the knockdown, drag-out argument against something that Wheelock... You know what, maybe that's on me. Maybe that's on me. Maybe Wheelock is not considering this to be a knockdown, drag-out argument. But he does certainly not seem in favor of these sentiments. We have just an interesting thought from page 44. And again, this is a chapter titled "The Poem in the Nuclear Age." In the nuclear age, nature, through the agency of man, who is a part of nature, has acquired the power to commit suicide. That's an interesting thought to me. I think that oftentimes when conceptualizing the nuclear age and the nuclear threat and mutually assured destruction and things like that, a nuclear holocaust, we very much see ourselves as separate from. We see ourselves as Dr. Frankenstein that toyed around and created the wrong thing. But really, the argument being put forth by Wheelock here is the same hippie argument with which he started the chapter, and, by the way, the same hippie argument with which he will end the chapter, that we're all connected, man, far out. Which is true. Which is true. But the thought that we are all one organism and mankind is simply the fatalistic mechanism of that organism. Humankind is the triggered moment when your favorite football team loses a game, right? Humankind is the triggered moment when your high school sweetheart broke your heart. We are the fatalistic mechanism. We are the ability to commit suicide, but also the possibility. Otters aren't going to get together and blow up the world. Neither will ants. We just might. And that is, we like to think of ourselves... I think that the more negative amongst us likes to think of humankind as a blight, which I don't think is fair. I really don't. But other than the small percentage of us who really consider humankind to be a blight, most of us like to think of humankind as really the bee's knees, if you will. We are what makes this planet worth coming to if you are an alien life form. But really, even if we're not a blight, we're certainly not the only show in town. And we just might be, basically we're a Woody Allen film. We're the Woody Allen film if you go to the cinema and there's a summer blockbuster showing, there's the feel-good family show. We're the Woody Allen film. That's what humankind is. I just thought that was an interesting thing to throw out there. But we have this in the form of we have the final paragraph of our chapter in the form of something which will need to be expressed here. Coming to us from pages 45 and 46. Above all, the nuclear age dramatizes and brings home to us with almost blinding vividness the fact of our mortality. Not simply the mortality of the individual, but of the race. Whether extinction comes as a result of a gradual process, of a cosmic accident, or of his own unbridled tension, man will not be eternal on this planet. The planet itself will not last forever. We are thereby instructed, once and for all, that the final values are not material and quantitative, mere mass, force, and duration, but spiritual and qualitative. Far out, man. The bit of brief consciousness that can take in the sweep of the galaxy, adding, in the creative merging of the subject and object, its truth and beauty and meaning to the brute swarms of matter orbiting through space, in the end, outweighs them all. The poem, in the nuclear age, will reveal a more immediate sense of the secret behind the tragic flux. And it is with this that I am absolutely sure, Wheelock has abandoned the core thrust of the promise of his titular question. No longer will we be seeking to define what is a poem. We're going to be hanging out in the woods and taking acid. This has turned to the hippie worst, and I am absolutely positive that from here out we will get snippets of brilliant prose. We will get interesting and startling, perhaps, insights. That is what we've gotten through the first 46 pages of this thing. But I don't think we're getting a definition of poetry. So if you like this sort of thing, maybe consider hitting the like button because it really helps us out on the channel. If you are interested in these sorts of discussions and you are not already subscribed, make sure you hit the subscribe button. If you are already subscribed but you don't get enough of my face, make sure you hit the bell icon next to the subscribe button and you'll get notifications for whenever we drop a video. And if you were inclined to help us make more content here on Strip Cover Lit, such as this, there is a link, as always, to our Patreon to be found in the description below.